we grow by taking action, right? There's no one that I've met that grows by not doing anything.
Yeah.
Complacency, mediocrity does not challenge
Or
me to
even
grow.
just planning, right? I'm just planning and not doing anything.
Yes.
Right.
The only way you grow, if you are truly on this podcast for life, leadership, and learning, your growth requires action. No one grows by doing nothing.
Welcome back. We're glad you're here for episode 7 of the ReedFlections podcast on life, leadership, and learning. I'm Art Calderon. I'll be steering us through our conversation today with Reed Nyffeler. If this is your first time joining us, Reed looks like a normal guy. He's not. He's not your average Joe. He's a husband. He's a father. He shares his time, talent, and treasure with those in the community and globally. He's a CEO of a global franchise firm headquartered in the heartland of America, a rapidly growing organization. He has a lot of personal and professional experiences that he will share to live a life on purpose. Now, on our first 4 episodes, we talked about priorities. Reed, we talked about number 1 priority, faith in God. Then we talked about family as a second priority, productivity, and finally, enjoyment and rest. Now, we're going to talk about developing productive habits, focusing on our priorities and our purpose with our habits, not just our thoughts. Now, our last episode, we talked about clear communication for relational connections, using our words to make sure that the connections that we have with individuals are clear and laid out. Now, today, we're not just going to stick with thinking and words, but we're going to talk about actions, how not to get stuck just saying what we want and not having actions that match. So what are the reasons you think it's so easy for us to get stuck saying words instead of actually taking action?
Yeah, I think, there's a lot of things that go into that. First of all, I would say the reconciliation between our words and our action is our credibility. So if we say something but don't do it, we don't have credibility.
Right.
If we say something and commit to it and do it, we ultimately have credibility. And so, one, when we say something, we're committing to something, right? Because that's the expectation of others. And so what we don't want to do is just communicate something for the sake of intention, right? Well, I intend to do this. So we want to make sure that our words, our yes be our yes or no be our no, are for the sake of commitment. And so then how do we demonstrate our level of commitment? That is our action. So when we choose our words carefully, we say, I will be here at 7 a.m., right? That is a commitment that we're making in our words, but our credibility will be based upon if we indeed show up at 7 a.m. And so that is the action that's behind that. And of course, that has multiple circumstances that plays out. And so in order for us to grow as a leader, to grow as a learner, to grow as someone that others are willing and interested in following, we have to have credibility.
Right.
And no one will follow someone that's incredible, right? So if, for example, you have somebody that's saying, I will be there at 7 o'clock, and consistently they don't show up. Pretty soon you're like, they're never going to be there at 7. I'll start showing up at 7:30, and or they're not going to show up at all. So now we're not even going to meet with them at just a simple time commitment of verbiage and then action. And then they have no credibility. So can't count on them, right? And that can be in your family, that can be in your work or otherwise. Now, conversely, if you know someone is going to be there, they're going to be completely prepared, and they're going to add value to that, they have credibility.
You can count on them.
You can count on them, right? And so if they say, hey, I will be there, and just think of this communication, and then it has to be demonstrated by action. I said, I'll be there at 7 o'clock, and I will be there prepared to discuss our actions podcast, and I will do advanced research so that it can be valuable time for you. And in your mind, Art, I would have established or built credibility, I presume, because now it's not just, he said he's going to do that, but right. I've seen and worked with Reed before. We're at podcast number 7 or 8 here, and he's done that every time, so I can fully expect that to be the case. So our actions are part of our credibility. And so some people may have a credibility issue.
Right.
And they're saying, I'm just going to promise more. I'm going to go tell them I'm better. I'm going to spend all my time saying these eloquent words that make them believe that I'm better. Nope. It's actually about actions.
Yeah.
And it's saying, do what you're saying. Say less, actually. The trap will be to say more and convince that party that you're credible. Nope. I'm going to say less and do more.
I remember one time when I was a young manager and I was hiring some people, and this one young man came and he gave a great interview. Mm-hmm. Very personable. However, I looked at his his resume, and he was like 6 months here, 8 months here, 6 months there, and I let my heart get overrule my head,
Right.
and I hired him, and it was a mess. I regretted it. It was hard. He was not showing up on time. Nice fella,
Right.
very personable, very he had great communication, but his actions did not follow his words.
Right.
It was like the opposite. It was the worst example of that.
Yeah, and we can give a couple examples of around that too, right? So a resume is written communication. We talked about that. That's your words, right? To your point. And we can be entrapped by what they're saying, right? And we can say, this guy's amazing to your point. Or they communicate amazing, but their actions are horrific, right? And we hire actions. And or let's look at social media. We can say, oh, their words super eloquent in the way they wrote that post
Yeah.
or that blog.
They must have a great life.
They must
Look
have a
at
great life. Or we'll look externally, right? I mean, there's Taylor Swift is her songs are amazing. You know, she just communicates in music so amazing. However, is she really that great of a person? I mean, let's be honest.
I never met
The
her.
perception is there. I'm not a Swiftie, and maybe I just lost the entire audience because I'm the only person in America that's
Everybody
not a Swiftie.
under 30 has just shut you
They
off.
did. They shut me off. But I'm saying we can then aggrandize someone that writes a great song. We can aggrandize somebody that writes a great poem. We can aggrandize somebody that writes a great post on social media, and those are the words. But then we quickly see, wait a minute, they don't have any credibility.
Right.
You know, they are not living what they say. And so, you know, a story that really comes to mind is I studied, you know, broadly iconic leaders. And one of the iconic leaders I studied was Martin Luther King Jr. I mean, I don't know that I've ever heard somebody more of an eloquent speaker that can speak to the hearts of millions of people more.
Oh, yeah.
And so he really was someone that had a mastery of his words. At the time, you know, race relations and culturally were terrible.
Right.
And so he knew it needed to change. And so then he flew over and spent some time with Gandhi. And he was in active defiance, starving himself. He literally would not comply with the regulation in a peaceful way, and he actually stopped eating. And he would just, his body was deteriorating, and it was very public display of that. And so Martin Luther King Jr. left there and says, I can't say it, I got to do it. And so he said, I'm done talking, we're going to go march the streets together.
Wow.
And I'm going to be the first person to the front, and I'm going to take the impact of those actions. I mean, he had bottles thrown at him. His house was started on fire. Then in a short period of time, 3 to 5 years, you saw the world change. And so that to me is the power of taking action in the words that we truly believe.
Yeah.
And why he did that, because I think this is also important. If you believe it so wholeheartedly but don't take action on it, do you really believe it?
Right.
If you believe something and you're trying to convince someone to do it wholeheartedly, so here I am as a leader and I get advice from people countless times. I mean, people tell me how I should run an organization, how I should lead my family. But at the same time is they won't do it for themselves. I mean, they're saying you should do this, this, and this, and this. And I'm saying you have no credibility because you haven't done it for yourself. So your words have to reconcile with your actions.
Well, let's talk about actions, because it is so easy in today's society to put words out there.
Yeah.
It used to be that the only person who would hear my words are the people in the room with me, or if I called on the phone, or maybe you got on radio, occasional TV. But now everybody has a platform to reach the entire globe with social media and with all the tools available. But it's that step that you talked about of actually taking the first step to action that is hard. Now, talk a little bit about why that is so hard, what to do, how to motivate oneself to go from just words to taking the actual step.
Yeah, and I think we'll take a half a step back on that because, you know, to your point, there is probably more words being spoken than any other time in history.
Right.
And because, you know, before we just had a handful of media channels, whether it was TV or radio or otherwise. Now it's social media prevalent. Everyone has a voice, and so there's noise. And we would think that would produce more action because there's more words.
Yeah.
You think words correlate. However, I think what has happened over time is there's less credibility. You know, let's look at the 50s and 60s, and this probably predates a lot of the audience, but there's Walter Cronkite. If he said it, it must have been happening, right? But what happened is their words and their credibility was eroded, right? If we look at another iconic leader, I've studied Abraham Lincoln. He was very, very intentional with the words he chose. He chose those words and he took action only on the words he said. And he learned that early in his career as a lawyer, that he said if he said something and didn't do it, his credibility would be affected. Now we have newscasters, social media people that are telling everyone else what to do, but don't apply it to their own lives. And so I don't think it's a matter of words. I think it's a matter of credibility. And so again, if we want to establish credibility, we must say in what we do. So I think what we should do is, it goes back to the previous podcast, carefully choose your words and recognize that when you say those words, you're committing your character to those words. And so then, if you're committing your character to those words, your credibility is based upon, are those words your character? Because it's often said that I can't hear what you're saying, your actions are speaking so loud.
Right.
That no matter what you are saying, here's what you're doing, so I don't believe you. Right? You can say, I'm sorry, I'm sorry, I'm sorry, I'm sorry, I'm sorry, if that's something you've done, but you continue in the bad habit. Are you really sorry? No, you're not. There's no credibility. People don't believe you when you say you're sorry, just as much as they don't believe you're going to be there at 7 a.m. on the other example. And so how do we make sure that there's credibility? First is actually look at what you're saying, like we said before. Then only say what you intend to follow through with. But it reminds me of the story of my second oldest daughter. So my wife is really, really diligent about doing what she says she's going to do. And so we were to Thanksgiving in front of all our family, right? This is an extended family. We see them once a year, and every other Thanksgiving in this case we're there. And my daughter was, I think, 2 or 3 at the time. And my daughter, my wife had said, you cannot get up from your seat until you finish your plate. And so here they are, and it's Thanksgiving. There's food that's unfamiliar with, and she had put green beans or whatever the food was, I don't know, on the plate. And it was a battle of wills at the time.
Uh-huh.
And so it was quite interesting to watch the whole thing play itself out. And so here is my daughter that didn't want to eat her green beans, whatever the food might have been, and my wife saying, no, you're not getting up until you do it. For my wife, it wasn't about the green beans.
Right.
It was a matter of credibility, saying, I told you as my child that you must complete this before you get up. And so now it was interesting because my aunt was commenting, said, it's only a couple of green beans. Those calories are not going to be there. So she's trying to weigh
she's
in.
recruiting the aunt now, huh?
Right. And so then my siblings, her siblings were like, come, we want to play with you. And she's begging to go play, right? Another piece. And then my parents were in there and they're commenting saying, oh, the other grandkids didn't eat theirs. So, this is comparative nature. She's fine too.
Yeah.
But what my wife knew, this was not about any of them.
Right.
This was about her credibility with her daughter, that she was going to have a relationship the rest of her life. So actions had to follow through with that. And so I'm not kidding. It was an hour and 15 minutes later.
Wow.
My daughter broke down and ate the last green beans, was able to get up right afterwards. And this is an embarrassing moment for the family. My daughter's crying. My wife is getting pressure from all these other parents that have been there before. And in the end, now, look at my daughter is high discipline, and I believe that's a critical moment.
Yeah.
Super high discipline because she understands that words and actions reconcile. Now we look back and we say, I'm giving leniency to all these other things. I'm going to give leniency here and here because I want empathy. So now what could have happened differently in that environment to give that story some more legs? One, we could say, just eat all that you can. And then my wife would have been free to let her eat all that she can, right? And it would have been something to reconcile that. And I think as parents, as leaders, as managers, we have to understand that if we are making a commitment to our employee, there may never come back and say it another time, but our credibility is on measure. So what do? We only say what we intend to do, and what we say, we do.
Excellent. Excellent. Well, say more about a time when you found it hard to take a first step and follow through on an action, because you've had quite a career in a lot of different fields, most recently with the franchising organization. So share a story about when you had to make that first step and it was hard and there was maybe some pushback.
Yeah. So I think, many times as leaders, we need to make a decision with limited information. And, the other thing is no matter what, right, you're not going to get everybody's agreement. That's just the reason. Right. I think people don't make hard decisions and ultimately commit to it is because they want to be people pleasers, right? They want to say, oh, I want to appeal to the entire audience. I mean, an example of that are, let's say we're going out to dinner as a family and we say, hey, where would you guys like to go? And I have 4 kids and they're all going to have a different answer and they can't agree and someone's authority should rule over somebody else's. And so ultimately we have to make a decision and make that decision that in a family scenario or in a work scenario that many people are not going to like. And so before we make that decision and take that action, we have to be 100% committed to see it all the way through. Now, making that decision in a work context, one of the things we did is we did a rebrand. This was a couple of years ago.
Got and a lot of pushback on that.
A lot of pushback on that because, as a franchisor, they were purchasing the brand and name, and there was an emotional attachment to it all. And I think that's something to really consider when you're taking an action. Most times it's not a physical attachment, it's an emotional attachment. And they will attach physical elements to it, but it's truly more emotional, right? And so
Right.
the brand, it was, yes, there's in our case wraps and business cards that need to be changed. That is physical, but more of it was an emotional change.
Right.
It was like, wait a minute, I've always been known as this
Uh-huh.
previous brand, and now we're switching to this new brand. And so I knew that I needed to have a thought through, thorough research in advance of taking that action, that I would never back away from it all. Because if I did, then my credibility going forward back to the daughter scenario would be broken down. And so then I had to recognize, okay, meet the first resistance. Because what happens is the most ardent people against you are going to be the first people running to you.
Say that again. The most
The people that don't like the decision the most
Uh-huh.
are going to be the first ones running to you.
with complaints.
Yes, complaints, concerns.
So they're going to
right?
be the loudest ones. They're going to be the ones that
Right. But generally speaking, it's a small group.
Yeah. Uh-huh.
Generally speaking, it's
Vocal but small.
Vocal but small.
Yeah.
And I said, okay, I appreciate this is what I say to them in here as we deliver those decisions. I say, okay, please have them come directly. I don't want anyone speaking on my behalf. And so what do? You address the single. You
Right.
address the individual that is confronting, and ultimately what you see that makes it more possible. And then you begin to develop the plan.
Yeah.
The other thing I would say, if you're trying to put things into action, is just do it.
Yeah.
It goes back to the Nike piece. Just do it. Take that first step. So there was using an Abraham Lincoln story. I remember when the Civil War was going on, and there was a series of complaints from the troops.
You remember when the Civil War was going on?
Yeah, well, I actually saw you were teaching me in class back in the Civil War. During the Civil War,
Okay. I got you.
the
I'm
story associated with the Civil War, I actually do vision trips, and I went to Harper's Ferry, Maryland,
Yeah.
Virginia, and West Virginia, actually. And so that was a battle point for the war. And as I was walking through there, they showed this is where Lincoln had walked. And as I continued to study Abraham Lincoln and the story, there was complaints that he was getting in the Oval Office or in the White House. They were saying, hey, we have a ton of people that don't have enough munitions, and the environment's not great. And
Yeah.
then the commanders say, we're great, we're fine. And so it's conflicting stories.
Uh-huh.
And so he took action. He said, you know what? I'm getting conflicting stories from the generals. I'm going to go there. And so literally on where the two rivers meet,
Mhm.
there was a command post that was there, and he walked that area where the delivery ships were being shot down with cannons for the one side, and where their conditions were and the food and everything else. And from there, taking action by not just sitting in his office and trying to, sign a bill into order or give commands that would otherwise not be executed upon, he walked around and saw the conditions. He took action.
Right.
And it was said in the stories that I read, his credibility
I'm
skyrocketed
sure.
because no longer is he just sitting in the White
Uh-huh.
House telling others what to do, but he walked in there and he was vulnerable in the Civil War,
Yeah.
right? He was the president they
He was
hated.
like 6'4" with that big hat.
That's
bopping
right.
around
They
too.
could see who he was. He took action, and it changed that outcome. And so
Yeah.
many would say that's impossible. You can't change the world. It's impossible. But he said by taking action, and his credibility was there, and he built a following, and he made it possible. We won the Civil War. His side won the Civil War, and
Yeah.
he saw the possibility by taking that impossible action of walking that.
And back to your example about the brand rebranding.
Mhm.
It's been a couple years now.
Yeah.
I haven't heard anybody say, "Man, I wish we could have went back. I wish we could go back to the old way." Everybody thinks it's great, the branding and everything, but you had to push through those initial vocal few and take that first step with action on your part to be able to push through the rest of the.
And that's
of the
kind of teeing up the
folks.
next podcast, right? Because the action for the first one is going to be the hardest, right?
Mhm,
But
mhm.
persistence is what creates a habit.
Mhm.
So if we merely take that action
Persistence.
once, right? So let's use an analogy of working out, right? So I'm saying, you know what? I'm going to go lose weight, right? And people make that comment all the time, New Year's resolution, whatever it might be. And they say, I'm going to go work out. And they work out one time. Right
Yeah.
now, clearly, they said they're going to work out tomorrow, and they worked out that day. However, is it pushing through the resistance? Oh, then the next day they're sore, or there's a change to their schedule and they can't make it.
Yeah.
So when do they really see results? When does it become a habit? Right, when they start to work out, right? And so, this reminds me of a story where you see these public figures, and this is one. There was a credibility item that I thought, is this person really who I thought it was? As an iconic leader for me. And so, one of the people I've always looked up as a mentor and leader is Tom Osborne. And for those that don't know, Tom Osborne was the 25-year head coach of Nebraska football. and that's my alma mater, and I went to school there.
Go Big Red,
And
folks.
yes, and he had struggled. However, he retired while I was in college there in the mid 90s. And they had won 3 championships out of 4 years. And then he retired after his third championship. And and it was quite interesting. Many people just looked at his retired. He was 65. However, I dove a little bit deeper. And so I was like, well, why did he retire at 65? He's at the pinnacle. He just won a championship 3 out of 4 years. You're building this whole legacy. And he said, I committed to my wife and family that I would retire at 65.
Wow.
He said, when I accepted the job, I've had so many sacrifices. He was a head coach in the late 70s and for 25 years. And he knew his priorities: faith, family, productivity, and rest and relaxation. And then I'll get to a follow-up story that led to his credibility, for me at least. So then he said he retired because he did that to commit to his family. His credibility with his family. He's going to retire. Then they said, what are you going to do? This is a retirement conversation. He says, well, I enjoy fly fishing, so it's time for rest and relaxation. He goes, I can go in the stream and fly fish. And clearly, if you had studied him, that was one of the things he enjoyed doing here in Nebraska, and he'd find things to be able to do that. And he said, but I'll still be around as you need me. I understand that. And so then 2 to 3 years later, he'd retired. And of course, I was devastated, right? Here's somebody that I really looked up to.
Yeah.
I mean, I was in college and watched it. The team was changing. I had athletes that were on my floor, and I could see their lives were materially changed, and many still speak about him
and they
as a
haven't
leader.
won a championship since.
Yeah, don't get me that level of devastation, because we've had struggle. We'd had winning seasons, never had a non-9-win season under his watch, et cetera, and bowl games and everything else, and all that's been vacated. But nonetheless, we all those things are because the leader left, and that could be the tangible elements of a leader, right? But I look deeper than that, because of course, do we follow a leader for their production or their credibility, right? That's a question that we should have. Are you following the leader because of what they do for you or who they make you become? Because if you're following somebody for what they do for you, as soon as they stop doing that for you, you no longer follow them.
Yeah.
So to continue that story, Tom Osborne, I continue to follow him. I still continue to follow him, right? I watch what he's doing. He was athletic director, and he actually ran for state office. So I was on a flight early in my career, maybe 2 to 3 years later, and sure enough, who walks on the plane?
No way.
Tom Osborne.
Were you the kids call that fangirling?
I was trying not to be honest with you, but fortunately for me, I was about 3 rows behind.
Okay.
And here he walks onto, yeah, okay. But I could be close enough, but not interrupt. And I mean, I'm like, everybody knew who he was. And it's a crowded plane. And he was flying to Connection, and so was I. And I saw that he was there. And sure enough, it was his second priority, his family. He was taking his family on a trip, right?
Wow.
With where he was. And guess what? He's sitting in coach. I mean, here's the guy.
What?
Yeah, he had ran for, he was a 1-term or 2-term maybe House of Representatives, and it was maybe lit before or afterwards. But here's a guy that ran for political office. Couldn't at the time be anybody more well known in Nebraska than Tom Osborne.
And he's flying coach.
He's flying coach.
Wow.
He sat on the aisle, maybe row 12. But that's not the impressive part, because then I'm watching him, and here it's 6 a.m. flight. At the flight takes off 6:15. What does he do? He pulls out his Bible. And he had his commitment, his quiet time right there on the plane at row 12 as a well-known icon here, because what was his number one priority? His faith. And so it was there that solidified, again, that my priorities are my commitments. And my commitments, if I'm not committed to those priorities, faith, family, productivity, and rest and relaxation in order, then am I truly committed to it? And if it becomes my priority, and it then develops into my thoughts that we talked about before, and then it becomes my words, am I truly taking action? And if someone like Tom Osborne, that it could have been a coach for 25 years, one of the most winningest coaches in college football history, they created a legacy that here is well and known, that he, in public setting, is living out his priorities for the world and or a young 20-something just starting his career to see. That's a model that I can ultimately follow. Wow. And that's why we're having this podcast, right? And so at the same time is here's the other side of that is, he wasn't doing that when he was alone. He is the same person, and that's what credibility is, when you're alone or when you're public. Because I can guarantee you, if you believe that he was doing that just on the plane for the show, you're missing it, because everybody else was sleeping. Right? I mean, it's a 6 a.m. flight, and you look around.
I'd be sleeping.
Absolutely. You sleep at 10 a.m. flights. I've seen that, right? Including on our trip to our convention. But that's beside the point. Ultimately, he's doing that in those environments as well. And so that's who he is. And that is his credibility in private and in public, whether he's alone or in a group.
So we talked about setting your priorities,
Mm-hmm.
about setting your thoughts, turning them into words.
That's right.
Now we're talking about actually action
That's
and
right.
that first step. How important that first step is in order to keep it from just being sort of academic,
Mm-hmm.
right? Was there ever a time when you didn't take that first step? What did that story look like?
Yeah, so I think absolutely. Many times we think of something that should be the case, and we ultimately want to do. In fact, in the business, there was a partnership that I'd actually, as a board, we had signed on. I was a minority, the largest shareholder, but still a minority owner, and it was replacing another shareholder. And so, as a board, we had agreed upon it, and we had signed the documentation, and then it was in due diligence. And so this group was in due diligence, and then as it progressed, I realized this is not going to be a good deal. I had committed it. I communicated it to the broad group, the franchise network at the time. I said, "Hey, I've decided to partner with this organization, and they're going to be going for it, and this is the time the transaction should close." And so here now, my credibility is online because I've committed to something. I've thought through it all. The timing was right. We needed it. All the above. However, I saw a major red flag in the process, and the red flag's immaterial. But then I said, I can't do this. It would be a mistake. And there's other people that are counting on this decision for a lot of reasons that need this decision. So what do I do? And so in that case, I had to make a new decision, right? Because I didn't change my commitment and say, no, I'm not going to do that. You make a new decision. And so what did I have? What did I do at that time? Because I took action and I didn't see it through, essentially. And I said, you know what? I made a mistake. I made a mistake. There was another piece of information that I didn't have at the time, so I need to make a new decision. So how do you maintain credibility when you take that first step in action on previous information you had, but now you need to make a new decision? And sometimes we're too caught up in saying, no, I didn't change. I didn't not take action. And we're arguing that. Instead, we say, you know what? I got new information. I went to the public audience and I said, we do need a partner. That hasn't changed. However, what changed was I picked the wrong one. And so then I reframed and got new partners and ultimately went forward, and it was the right decision. So if you're in a place where you've verbally committed to something, and then you recognize as you take that first step of action that, you know what, I might have made a mistake, cancel it. Don't think that I said it, I have to do it, but then subsequently make a new decision to maintain credibility, saying in this process of taking action, I realize something and I communicate that, and that requires humility and growth. And that's a new decision, not saying I'm not accomplishing the other one, because many people govern their decisions and don't take action because they're afraid of failure. I think that's the underlying piece. They're afraid of failure or letting someone down. But what we should say is don't be afraid of failure. Be afraid of not growing. Because if we grow by taking action, right? There's no one that I've met that grows by not doing anything.
Right. Yeah.
Complacency, mediocrity does not challenge
or
you to
even
grow.
just planning, right? I'm just planning and not doing anything.
Yes.
Right.
The only way you grow, if you are truly on this podcast for life, leadership, and learning, your growth requires action. No one grows by doing nothing and staying stagnant. So
great. Well, that's very well said. I appreciate that. I want to thank Reed for reminding us about ways to develop helpful habits and for sharing more about the importance of taking action so we don't get stuck simply saying we need to do something instead of actually doing it. Thank you, listeners, for joining us on ReedFlections, podcast on life, leadership, and learning. Next time, we'll talk about the value of diligent practice. We can achieve excellence by trying something only once. Until then, I'm Art Calderon. Be purposeful.
And the last word. So when you are thinking, you know what, I've said this, or maybe I haven't said this, take that first step. Just do it. And then make a new decision. Some of you are saying, I'm afraid of failure. What will other people think of me? I think that's the number one reason people don't take action and judgment. Realize you're making a commitment to yourself first and foremost. If you can't commit to yourself, you're not committing to anybody else. Commit to yourself that today you're going to take action. Then learn from that action and make adjustments going forward. So commit to yourself to take action on what you said today. And next week, we'll talk about practicing and improving from there.